If there's nobody there and there's nothing to do,
Strong language here.
why are they teaching in the first place?
Don't forget the imaginary objects.
That, to me, is the real teaching.
I completely disagree. I don't think that feeling that everything is one is an effective way for treating anything better.
I'd like to begin by asking you about your personal story and how it is that you yourself became a seeker, became somebody who was interested in the spiritual path. How did that evolve for you?
Just got a question. I go through different phases of like enjoying interviews and wanting to, I always enjoy interviews, but there's a different phases of like enjoying listening to the stories of the individual who is, who is being interviewed. And other times where I really am like kind of annoyed that they would even have the audacity to evoke their own personal past history. You get what I mean here? Like, we're supposed to be going to know self. Why bring up your own, So I wonder what it is that triggers that in me, and I wonder if that happens to other people. Do you care about the history of these teachers, or do you just want to get the information from them? Yeah, I flipped through that so many times, and sometimes really strongly, and it's kind of strange. Hey, what's up? Secret cache. What's going on? It's so weird though. How do you I don't know. Sometimes. Casper, hey, Casper, welcome to the stream. We're watching some spiritual stuff.
My mother and stepfather were very interested in these matters, so I grew up in an atmosphere of non-duality. They belonged to
grew up with non-duality. Very cool.
The Study Society in London, which studied and practiced the classical teaching of Advaita Vedanta. So all during my teenage years, I was exposed to this. My mother and stepfather had friends that would come to the house. So the kind of conversations, I was familiar with the conversations. I met a lot of people.
You love spiritual stuff. Awesome. Whoa, that's awesome. Advaita things we're getting to. It's important. Some people think God is about knowledge claims, when for a lot of people, it just started with the quest to end suffering. Not having to do with knowing. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Even the idea of evoking seeker makes it seem like they're seeking, well, I guess that's my own projection. It makes it seem like they're seeking truth or seeking knowledge when it's really seeking the end of suffering sometimes. And it is kind of like humanizing, I guess, validating even, validating your own experience. If you hear the struggles of people like Eckhart Tolle and that sort of thing, where they're just depressed and they want to end, they want to end it all, really, but they really want to end the suffering. And yeah. But then there's sometimes where, sometimes where I just want the answer and I don't want to hear their personal nonsense because I'm only concerned about my own personal nonsense. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Definitely. Yeah.
People, of course, much older than me, who were interested in these matters. So it was offered to me on a plate in a way. I didn't have to go very far to find it.
Interesting.
So I became interested in these matters. I actually first started reading the poetry of Rumi aged about 15, long before Coleman Barks and others made him popular and made his writing more accessible to the West. I read the rather dry and I still think very beautiful translations by Arbery and Nicholson, which were the only translations that were available at the time, but I loved them. And so this was my first, this was a kind of was a first sort of heart awakening. And I then became more interested in the Advaita philosophy that I found out about through the friends that my parents knew. So in my late teens, I started mantra meditation, and I remained at the Study Society at College House in London for the next 20 years or so, practicing and studying practicing meditation, mantra meditation, and studying the classical Advaita Vedanta teaching, which I loved dearly. But at the same time, I couldn't quite make it my own. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I met Francis Lucille, who himself had been a student of Jean Klein's. And Francis introduced me to Atmananda Krishna Menon and the direct path, and also the tantric approach to the body. And so,
Interesting. I wonder what he means by making the practice his own. I can feel the emotionality in what that means. I can understand vaguely. But I'd love to hear what he means exactly by that, and how other people can search through different traditions and find a practice that they can make their own. I like that he put it that way, though, because sometimes when we hear from these sort of spiritual teachers and they talk about their practice, they often give their practice as the truth, not as something that they've resonated with, and a great pointer to truth. I like that he said it in that way. Sometimes the life stories emphasize how the truths and are found and embodied in the lived experience. Yeah, exactly. So it makes it less conceptual. Yeah. And it does give it that sort of emotional and realistic human feel to it. And now I'm saying it, so because sometimes I talk about how we need to separate science and separate spirituality and science, because we don't want to keep up propping spirituality when we have we don't want to keep on propping up science when we use science to justify our spirituality. And I think that same thing happens with emotions. Or sometimes we prop up emotions when we talk about spirituality, because it's helpful in a very emotional sense, right? And it has that emotional weight. But then we could get carried away thinking that it's all an emotional pursuit. It's a spiritual pursuit. And it should be all even, The emotions are not better than science, which is not better than spirituality. None of it's better than anything. It's all even. And sometimes if we get overly emotional, or if we overly emphasize the emotional part, that can be taken away in saying that the emotions are more important than the raw spiritual pursuit. But of course, there's no raw spiritual. There's no untangling these things. But I think you get the picture. There are ways to prop up some things unfairly. I don't know how to put it really, but propping up some things unnecessarily, maybe. And then, of course, at the wrong times, when it's not something that I need to be that's emphasized in my life at the moment. Yeah, definitely.
this was, things changed for me quite rapidly then. From my mid-30s onwards, I spent the next 13 or so years, I spent as much time as I could with Francis and in Europe and America, studying the direct path. So I kind of went from the classical Advaita path. That was my sort of background. But it was really this direct approach that I learned through Francis that really made the difference.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Well, when I say it made a difference, the Advaita Vedanta teaching had a very profound effect on my life, but it wasn't until I met Francis and came across the direct path that I really felt that I could make the understanding my own.
Mm. And what was it about that earlier teaching, the classic Vedanta Advaita approach, that didn't resonate for you?
That didn't resonate for me, or it was primarily a devotional path, and I started off when I was young. I had a very Christian upbringing. I had a very strong feeling for God. Then, as I said, I was very interested in Rumi's poetry, and so the devotional approach of the classical Advaita system was just a natural step for me. But my mind was also asking questions.
Interesting.
And I wasn't finding answers to my questions. That the formulations they didn't seem quite in line with my questions, with my era, with my culture. So there was it was as if I came up against a wall.
That's super interesting. Like he's saying that there's sort of a familiarity with the Advaita thing that he had, which was not helpful. It's good and familiar. It's the same devotional things that he's used to with his other teachings that he sort of grew up with more so. But then he had these questions that were deviating from that typical thing, and they remained unanswered because he was still in the familiar territory. So when something familiar doesn't resonate because it doesn't answer your questions, that's very
I
interesting.
couldn't find answers to the questions that I was asking. It satisfied my heart,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't satisfy my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Interesting.
think the two need to be attended to equally.
Yeah. And did it not speak to you as a man in the world, in a relationship with a career? And was it the
No,
embodiment of it that was?
there was some conflict between, I was 16, 17 years old when I first started practicing mantra meditation and studying the Advaita teaching. And then sort of for the next 20 years, I embarked on my life as an artist, as a potter, and I had an intimate relationship. And so I loved life.
Mm.
I wasn't a natural renunciate or a reclusive. I loved life. I love relationship. I love activity. I loved objects. I spent my life in my studio making objects. I love beauty. And so, and yet the Advaita teaching was kind of turning away from, encouraged one to turn away, at least to a degree, from the objective content of experience. So there was a mismatch between my love of truth and my love of beauty. And it really wasn't until I met Francis that I realized that these two loves were really the same love, but until that time they had been in conflict with one another. So yes, there was I couldn't find a way to integrate the classical Advaita teachings into my life.
And what about the conflict between being an artist and being a seeker / teacher, somebody on the path
this is awesome.
of liberation? Was there a conflict between your ambition as an artist or that creative impulse? Did you perceive there to be a conflict that you were then able to resolve?
I wasn't really able to resolve it until I came across Francis and the direct path and the tantric approach, because the tantric approach, as you know, it lays a lot of emphasis on beauty. The sensual experience is not denied; on the contrary, it is sublimated. It's so. But up until that time, that there was a conflict between the fact that in my studio by day, I was making objects, and I loved objects. I felt a little apologetic about my love of objects and my love of beauty. And then by night, I would go back to my bedroom and read Ramana Maharshi. And so it took some time for these two paths to be reconciled.
Yeah, that's really tough when you have this ideal of, I guess, not clinging to things, right? Not clinging to particular experiences or objects. But to not cling doesn't mean to push it away. But it's so weird because you have the training, like in our in our normal sort of habitual, even in our societal cultural conditioning, having things you crave and you have, and whenever you have something, it sort of reinforces that craving. It doesn't need to, and you can train that away, which is, integrating the renunciation and the having and living in the society. But you have to be super honest with yourself to be able to have the ability to still do things, eat nice foods, get new fancy technologies and all that stuff without actually reinforcing that craving. And it can feel very conflicting when you have things that you like. I like music a lot. And I have trouble making music. My beautiful piano right there, you can see a bit of it. I like to play a lot, but sometimes I'm playing and I'm just reinforcing a craving, a desire to express or something like that. And other times I'm playing and I'm just letting it flow through. It's hard to untangle when is what, which is which. A good way for me to do it is to stay away from it for a long time. Then I can really tell when it's it's just trying to perpetuate this idea of clinging on to something. I need everything to be perfect. I want to make this perfect sound, so on and so forth. You get the picture. And the same for creating pottery, I think. Or any experience, any sensual experience. But when you get away from that desire to have sensual experiences, creating, having, watching, liking, get away from that, you can return to it much more purely. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
In fact, I think this is the great contribution that the Vedantic approach has made to the spiritual tradition is the inward-facing path, as I sometimes refer to it, the path of self-inquiry, the turning away from the content of experience towards the subject, towards pure consciousness. I think that I don't know any tradition that does that as well as the Vedantic tradition. However, it is not so strong on the turning back towards experience and integrating our understanding with our lived and felt experience. I think the tantric traditions do that more successfully, but they're not so, in my opinion, they're not so clear on the inward-facing path. So that's
interesting. Not to cherish both the angel and the animal, both the spirit and the flesh, is to renounce the whole interest and greatness of being human. It is really tragic that those in whom the two natures are equally strong should be made to feel in conflict with themselves. Yep. For the saint sinner and the mystic sensualist is always the most interesting type of human being because they're the most complete. Yeah. And it's very easy to feel, to get that I don't know, it's difficult because we think, when we do things, it does perpetuate some craving sometimes, most times. But then you can get beyond it and then be shamed by other people who are like in your spiritual circles. So you're a spiritual person, other people are spiritual people, and you're sort of engaging with sensuality, but you're free from that sensual craving. So you aren't really engaging with it, you're free from it. But it seems like you're engaging with it, and then you're shamed for it. Now these people want you to have the most obvious expression of disconnected from your sensual pleasures. The most obvious expression is not engaging, but that's not the only expression. It's so tricky, it's so hard to do, to get that fine balance in yourself, and then of course to not be bothered by the other people from the outside who are judging, thinking that your expression is incomplete or incorrect. It's tough. And it feels like Rupert's saying that the tantric, doesn't matter how I say it, the tantric approach is too one-sided on the expression of the sort of negative part. I feel like I maybe misheard a little bit. I'm not sure if I completely followed, but they're not as holistic. It's hard to discern if somebody's being free from it or not. Yeah, usually the best way is to let go of the need to know if they are. Yeah. No need to try to confirm if other people are spiritually enlightened or whatever. In fact, very important. Very important. Let go of that for yourself. Really, the focus should be more inwards. And you'll know for yourself when you've let go of that need. But then how do you express that need? I don't know. It's tricky. It's all tricky.
why I ended up with a balance between.
But it involves lots of honesty with yourself and actually just paying attention to your own experience and making sure you're not causing more of your own suffering and not causing any of your own resistance. Very important.
These two.
I think that saying Tantra is less emphasizing the internal. Yeah. And he's talking about the emphasis of Tantra on ritual deities and gurus, but the external, to be honest, you think actually Tantra is more focused on the internal. Interesting. Just as focused. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. The hardest part, maybe not the hardest part. A lot of these parts are so, I'm saying everything is tricky and I'm saying everything's hard. So I don't know if it's the hardest part, but it's so weird to like look at, for example, like look at any person, individual from the outside and then trying to interpret their, internal being. And we have to kind of let that go. We almost have to let it go for ourselves because it's hard to interpret what we're feeling ourselves, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. But then when we look at other traditions, like if we are let's say, non-spiritual at all, and we look at any spiritual person, we're like projecting so much, generally negative things into them. We're hyper-focusing on the negatives. And the same can be when you're within a spiritual thing, you're a spiritual already, and you're looking at the Tantra from the outside, and you don't see how holistic it is. Or maybe you're Tantra, and you're looking at classical sort of, Buddhist Pali Theravada stuff, and you're not seeing any outward expression, so you think that it's not very holistic. But again, that's an outside perspective of a whole tradition. There's probably that same misapplication of trying to read into any tradition or any individual where we're hyper focusing on the negative parts and missing the holistic aspect of all of it. Something we can be aware of.
Approaches.
And do you consider the direct path particularly useful for the way we live today as spiritual people in the world?
I do, Mark. I feel that the direct path is really the path for our age.
Mm-hmm.
It requires no affiliation to any particular teacher or any tradition. There is nothing to subscribe to. There is nothing to believe in. There is nothing to commit to. And it is, of course, anything we say is conditioned by the culture in which we were raised, including the conversation that you and I are having. So, of course, all words come packaged in the conditioning in which they arise. But the direct path is I think, as much as is possible, the essential understanding has been divested of all its local, temporal, cultural traditions. It has nothing to do with Christianity, Buddhism, Sufism, Hinduism, Advaita. It is just a clean, clear, contemporary formulation of the great understanding in a way that is consistent with contemporary language and contemporary life. So I feel, to answer your question, yes, I feel it is the path that is most suited to our era.
Did you define the direct path? Is this self-inquiry? Well,
and it may not have been possible. It may have, humanity up until now may not have been ready for this very direct approach. Of course, it was always available, but it tended to be only given out in rather special, secret circumstances. But now it is being made widely available, and I think it's not a coincidence that it's being made widely available now. Our culture, our world culture, is ready for it now. Mm-hmm.
And it has particular unique difficulties, I think, as a path. And
tell me what you think the difficulties are, Mark.
When I talk about the direct path with friends, it feels particularly, strangely to say this, but women that I speak to, they feel like it seems intellectual and a bit dry to them. It seems abstract. There's no, as you say, there's no real devotion in it per se. And so I do know people who have trouble with they want more how-to.
Yes.
Which
it's quite similar to Advaita, Dogshin, Chan, and all those very direct stuff, but none of them exactly. It's his own formulation. Oh, okay, he's got a new form of self-inquiry. That's interesting. Dzogchen. I don't know. Yeah, I guess they're all similar. Okay.
Reminds me of Krishnamurti and the truth of being a pathless land, which was my first love. That doesn't appeal to many people.
Yes,
it's rigorous and steep.
Yes, you said it's no devotion. It doesn't have a devotional aspect. I understand, of course, why you say that. It doesn't have a devotional aspect in the sense of having a person or a deity to direct one's love towards, but it is devotional in the sense that it is devoted to the truth or the reality of our actual experience. In that path, I consider it to be the height of the path of devotion.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But in some point, the path of devotion, the object of devotion, must dissolve.
That's interesting. So I like I like how he's saying he's being very charitable to himself, obviously, because he is himself in his own tradition. But he's aware of other people seeing it from the outside in a weird way. So he says, I know that you see it as not devotional. I can tell, I understand why you say that, but it's actually very devotional. And surely that's going to happen with every single other tradition. Right? If you say your tradition is not something, they're going to say, well, I understand why you think that. However, so that's very interesting. I have to point that out.
Otherwise, we remain in the subject-object relationship. So at the early stages of the path of devotion, the devotee and the beloved remain. And particularly for one on a path of devotion, one who has been accustomed to devoting themselves to the beloved, whether the beloved is a person or a deity, in the higher stages of the path of devotion, the subject and the object, the lover and the beloved, must dissolve. And that is, I think, a danger on the path of devotion. It's our reluctance to give up the object of our devotion. Of course, there are parallel pitfalls on the path of knowledge as well. I readily accept that.
And what might some of those pitfalls on the path of knowledge be?
The turning away from experience and never turning back towards it again. That's the main one, is that one turns away from the content of experience in order to recognize one's essential nature, and one just remains there. And never integrates one's new understanding of oneself with one's lived and felt experience in life. And even worse, one uses the recognition of one's true nature, the subject of the experience, to absolve oneself of the responsibility of leading a decent, loving, intelligent, sane, just life. In other words, we use the recognition, or the so-called recognition of our true nature, to justify behavior that falls considerably short of it.
Yes.
Yeah, this is, again, I'm going to keep mentioning it until I figure this idea out, or until it's more internalized in myself here. But you can become awakened in different ways, in different trainings, right? And he's saying you could be fully awakened in terms of seeing everything clearly, but have no ethical training. And in fact, use that framework of being awakened by seeing clearly to justify your bad behavior, because it's all just sensations. And I feel like this is not, I wonder why it's not quite broken up more often, or finally distinguished in this way more often, to say that if you see more clearly, you have no suffering, so you're awakened in some sense. You're awakened, but you may not have good behavior. You may not actually feel well, whatever. And if you actually have correct actions all the time, but you don't have like any training in terms of seeing clearly, you're awakened. You're doing all the actions to stop your suffering, and maybe even help other people to stop suffering, and that's great. So you're awakened ethically, but not in terms of seeing clearly, not in terms of knowing your own true nature, not the path of knowledge, right? Not insight. And then you can be awakened in the loving path, or the joyous path, or the happiness, whatever, shamatha, without ever seeing clearly. You don't know that you're the entire universe. You just feel love everywhere. You're still you. You don't see that clearly, and you don't really care about ethics. So why don't we break down these different types of enlightenment? I wonder. I don't know why. But I feel like that would be a very helpful distinction, so that we can understand when somebody says they're enlightened, they can be enlightened in a particular way, and we can learn from them from these particular things, and not necessarily always assume that if you can see clearly, you suddenly must feel radiate love and all that stuff, and you must suddenly act ethically, because that's clearly not the case.
Those would be two of the pitfalls. And another pitfall that you have already mentioned is that it can become heady.
I would also wonder if there are other areas where you can be enlightened, where other areas where you can have a permanent perspective shift, which ends suffering. This is maybe what I'm saying here. What I mean by that, I'm the only person I've made the distinction. Yeah. But it makes so much more sense, right, to break it up in those three ways. Yeah, I don't know why it's not pointed out ever. I don't know, but yeah, when I noticing how this happens, it makes so much more sense, I think, and it makes so much sense that you can train in each particular way, and how much they help each other too.
If it's not really grounded in experience. So, but both paths, the inward-facing path, which as I said, I feel is best exemplified in the Vedantic tradition, and the outward-facing path, the Tantric path, both these paths, that they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses.
I'd like to ask you about the seeker's path itself, Rupert. Let's talk a little bit about spiritual materialism, which I think is such an important and often overlooked aspect of what happens as we pursue spiritual matters. How do you address spiritual materialism, and how do we not fall into that trap?
Mark, can you, for all of us, define what you mean by that? Because people mean, I've noticed, slightly different things by the term spiritual materialism. What do you understand by the term?
Well, I'm thinking about Trungpa, and I'm thinking about turning enlightenment into another goal, another object, something else to attain.
Interesting. We just watched the Trungpa. What is he, a proponent of spiritual materialism? I guess maybe not a proponent, obviously, but did he fall into some traps here, wanting better experiences or trying to make people seek something more? That's interesting. Oh, he coined the term. Oh, he did not fall into these traps. Smart guy. Interesting. Yeah, I don't.
And wearing one's seekerhood heavily.
So this is spiritual materialism, having cool experiences and wanting to accumulate more experiences, accumulate more attainments, and possibly even show them off. And that's sort of my understanding of that phrase when I hear it.
Ostentatiously, self-righteously, attaching egotistically to the very thing that is meant to liberate you from the ego.
Ego of no ego. I've heard it said as that before too. Ego of no ego.
Creating an identity around being a spiritual seeker.
Yes, and turning it into another commodity, really.
Yep.
You're turning wisdom into another commodity. How wise are you? Have you done that workshop? Oh, I had that awakening. Oh, that chakra got touched in that workshop. It becomes very materialistic. So it's a material approach to what is essentially, obviously, not metaphysical.
It's difficult for me to comment on that, Mark, because I never come across it.
Interesting.
Really?
None of the people that attend my meetings are afflicted with this attitude. I mean, of course, I to the extent that I know what's going on in the kind of broader world of.
One of the things with the three paths is that the other two paths of ethics and shamatha are much more emphasized during the person stuff, and the insight stuff is much more emphasized in the videos. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've never gone through any actual retreats or workshops or anything like that. So yeah, there may be a much stronger focus on, well, obviously, if you go to a retreat center, you generally follow, I mean, if it's a Buddhist thing, you follow the precepts, but you're usually, even if it's like Hindu traditions, I mean, even Christian contemplative traditions, you are definitely staying away from stimuli. You're probably not eating meat. You're not overeating it, at least. And that's pretty ethical, right? You're not having sex and all that stuff. So, I mean, it's definitely emphasized. I don't know if it's explicitly emphasized, but it's spoken about, but it's definitely emphasized, certainly. Ego, like, yeah, it's escaping me right now. Let me get more of that, more. Yeah, the ego do be like that.
New Age spirituality, I'm
Ego's
I'm aware of
tricky.
it, but it's not something that I come across. And I think if this attitude of spiritual materialism is simply not entertained by the teacher, then the gathering of the group of friends that gathers around the teacher, I don't mean in a formal community, I mean just the people that attend the meetings, and if it's not supported in any way, then they tend not to express this. As I say, I come
makes a lot of
across it.
sense.
I never come across it.
Makes sense.
And so you don't come across ambition, spiritual ambition, in your meetings or in your
The people that attend my meetings are people that either they fall into two camps, either because they long for happiness or they want to know the nature of reality. 80% come because they suffer and they want to be happy. And they've tried everything else and it's failed. So spiritual life is the one unexplored avenue. Though that's how most people come. I'm suffering, I want to be happy. Others, perhaps those a little more intellectually inclined, because they want to know the nature of reality. They notice that whatever we know of the world is obviously filtered through sense perception. In other words, sense perception imposes its own limitation on reality. So what is reality divested of the limitations that our senses impose on it? Actually, in the end, these two questions turn out to be the same question, but they're two different ways of approaching it. And the vast majority of people, and I would say everyone that I come across in my meetings, that are interested in these two things.
Yeah, just know your nature and you escape the suffering. I mean, they work together very much, and they're so related. But either one, if you want, they help. They work.
I want to be happy, or I want to know what's true, or what's real.
Yes.
And they're very unpretentious people. Not usually not big egos. Very sincere. They just want to be happy, and so we embark on this very experiential exploration of the nature of happiness or the nature of reality.
I'm sort of just kind of thinking about it. This is my general squeamishness with drugs. I like people who are hippies. I used to be very much into hippie communities and like going to Burns all the time, that kind of thing. If you're familiar with Burns, like Burning Man, or other festivals. And I really like the energy and I like the people there, and it's super awesome. But that sort of, there's a bit of that spiritual materialism going on where they want to have all these experiences, or they want to have these attainments, and they generally like to tell people about it. And I feel like that's we talk about drugs occasionally here, and I have I'm very squeamish about it. I very much discourage drug usage because of this. And this, I guess I'm sometimes overemphasize that trap that can happen. So it'd be interesting to hear like a person who is more into the path of taking drugs and using that as a springboard for this type of stuff. To talk more about the spiritual materialism and how to get beyond that and how to work through that sort of thing that may happen. I'd love to hear more about that.
And so I don't come across a lot of people with huge egos who have become kind of spiritual egos, who claim to be enlightened, who claim some marvelous understanding. Of course, as I said earlier, I'm aware that it goes on out there, but
Right.
I seldom come across it.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking it's because of the teaching itself. It doesn't really offer any rewards in the sense of you're going to get to that level, and then you get this, and then you get that.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's what I meant when I said if it's not supported in any way by the teaching.
Right.
For instance, I never use the word enlightenment unless somebody asks me a question using the term enlightenment. If somebody says to me, what is enlightenment? Then of course I'll use the term because they've used the term. But I would never.
Thanks for hanging out.
Never. Very
Always happy
rarely
to have you here, Benevolent.
use the term enlightenment because
elephant.
it's so laden with association.
Why do I feel like that should rhyme? Benevolent elephant. I want it to rhyme, but it doesn't rhyme. I want it to rhyme. But anyway, thanks for hanging out, man. Super appreciate it. Enjoy your meal.
And the very association to which you are referring, the enlightenment is this marvelous experience that if you work hard enough and meditate for long enough, you're going to have this.
Benevolent elephant. Yeah? Benevolent elephant. It does rhyme. Benevolent elephant. Benevolent elephant. Okay, I'm getting caught up.
Incredible experience, which will distinguish you from everybody else, and you suddenly you're above the fray from then on. This very traditional view of enlightenment, at least those of us in the West who travelled either physically or intellectually to India during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
We acquired this rather romantic and misguided sense of enlightenment.
It's all exotic out there, the mystics in Tibet and the people who are in the Himalayas meditating for hours and hours. It's all out there. Yeah, interesting.
So for that reason, I tend not to use the word. I talk about just the recognition of our being. And you can't really build a very big ego around the recognition of your being. Just the recognition of one's simple being and its innate peace. You just can't build an ego around it. You can't. There's nothing there to claim. I never make any claims about myself. So I think you're right that there's not much to build an ego around. And if someone were to do so in the community of friends that has gathered around this teaching, it would not be confronted. It would just simply not. It would not be attended to. It would just be completely ignored. It's just not. I just have no interest in it. It would,
which is pretty much the best way to handle behavior that you don't want to be emphasized. Just ignore it, and it kind of fades away, dissolves away. I'm not sure if that applies generally to everything, but in terms of dealing with people and having some negative behaviors, ignoring it is probably the best. Very interesting.
We just don't go there. So such a person would either fall in line fairly quickly, or they'd leave. and I wouldn't hear from them again. But most people have already done their research these days on YouTube. So if they come to...
But that's so different for your own behaviors, right? You don't want to just ignore your own behaviors because then they kind of perpetuate it. They may... I guess if we don't... I don't know. I have to think about this. That's interesting. Okay, I've got something to think about now.
My meetings, they already know roughly what to expect. So people, the filter has already taken place. People that I notice that the people that come to my meetings, that they're sincere truth seekers and truth lovers, and that they just want to be happy or to know truth or reality.
Yeah, I guess the model would be not to encourage. It's not necessarily you have to ignore it, just not encourage it, right? It's one idea I like to say, you let your karma play out, you just don't add to it. So you do some you've got some cravings, sometimes you give into them, and that's fine. As long as you don't when you don't have to. You don't add to the karma. You let it play out. It's like you're bouncing a basketball, and somebody says, put the basketball on the ground. You can try to force it onto the ground, or you can stop and let the karma play out, and eventually it's all settled. So I think that applies generally to other people's actions and your own actions. Don't push, don't pull. Not necessarily ignore, that's sort of the typical way of saying it, but don't push, don't pull, let it settle.
You talk about 80% or so of the people coming to you looking for relief from suffering. And I know that for myself, when I first started to practice, I thought that spirituality would make my pain go away. And I was in for a big surprise because it was made me so much more aware.
You're sensitive to
of
the pain.
suffering.
Yeah.
Not that one has to become very aware of it before you move into another phase. How do you respond to the idea of spirituality making your pain go away, and folks who approach the path with that motivation?
Well, I agree with what you say in the sense that very often, for many of us, our suffering is so painful and unbearable that we don't fully feel it. We're so busy escaping from it, either medicating it away or meditating it away, or doing something more or less refined through substances, activities, relationships, etc. Doing something to prevent us from having to fully feel or face the discomfort of our suffering. So I agree with you that in the early stages of this investigation, it requires a process of facing one's suffering, not avoiding it, opening oneself to it, welcoming it, embracing it, rather than turning away from it. However, that is, I would suggest, only the first stage, and that as one develops, there is in most cases, a gradual, occasionally, suddenly, a dissolution of one's suffering. So I do think that the recognition of one's true nature, by which I mean simply the recognition of the nature of one's being, before it is qualified or colored by experience, does bring relief from suffering. Because the nature of our being, there are many ways we could speak about our being, but one of the simplest ways of describing the nature of our being would just be that its nature is peace. It is inherently peaceful or inherently fulfilled. So if one is in touch with one's true nature, one feels its innate peace and joy. And this does bring about a reduction or dissolution in our suffering.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So one might encounter difficulty, encounter pain, encounter loss, encounter reasons for suffering, but underneath it, there's the awareness of the nature of being, so it doesn't land in the same way, it doesn't stick in the same way?
Yes, and to begin with, one can travel all the way back through the layers of experience, through our thoughts, through our feelings, and until we, for want of a better term, arrive at our being. Of course, we don't really arrive there, but you understand.
Yeah.
I mean, we get in touch with our being, which seems to lie behind the content of our experience. And to begin with, this seems to be something that we visit briefly from time to time, and then we get lost in experience again. And as a result, of course, we suffer. We identify ourselves with the content of experience, and in which case we have to trace our way back again to our essential being. We recognize it again. We taste its innate peace and its fulfillment, and this back and forth happens for some time. But after a while, our being is not something that we just visit from time to time, like a like a cottage in the country that we go to at the weekend. We move in.
Mm.
It becomes our new identity.
Mhm.
And as to the extent that our being, our essential being, becomes our new identity, we remain in touch with its innate peace, not just in the background of experience, but in the midst of experience.
That's so interesting to me. I've never had this. I'm not a very advanced meditator here. But there's the idea here that he's saying right now that there's a perception shift, which I've experienced some shifts in my perception, but he's saying that it's permanent, not that it's like a weekend vacation where you see your true nature. It becomes your home. So you see in this super high resolution, it's kind of how I put it, you see high resolution, you can see that everything is just experiences happening, and you don't tangle them up to see a self. You can very clearly separate each strand, and that is your home base. That's kind of baffling to me. That at some point there's a complete perception shift where things never go back to how they were, and you just see through everything. That's
So the
very
piece of our true
interesting.
nature that normally lies in the background of our experience begins to percolate into the foreground of our experience and pervade the foreground of our experience. And as a result, it's not, and as a result, suffering, it rises less and less. It is outshone by the peace of our true nature, and in time, it simply ceases rising.
Mm. So may I ask you, for someone like yourself who's been doing this work for many, many years, confronting the world situation today and the pain, the loss, the suffering, the confusion, the danger, how do you respond inwardly to this? Does it cause you grief? I'm curious to know.
Yes, when I see anybody suffering, whether it's the relatively few people I meet these days because of the situation, but when I hear or read or see on the news of the enormous amount of suffering in the world, it melts my heart every time I see it. And the vast majority of our suffering, I'm not speaking of situations that are physically challenging. I'm speaking now of psychological suffering. The psychological suffering that people experience is due to losing touch with their being and its innate peace. And so my response to it is to want to share this simple experiential understanding that the peace of one's true nature, the peace of one's essential being is available to everyone. One doesn't have to devote yourself to a teacher. You don't have to subscribe to any particular religion or spiritual community or tradition. You don't have to change your life. You don't have to meditate for 8 hours a day. It's just available. Everyone's being lies in the background of their experience, and in most cases it is simply overlooked in favor of the content of experience. So whenever I see someone suffering, my heart response to it is go back to your being. That's where the peace you long for lives.
And what about fear, Rupert? I mean, do you?
I love. I mean, this idea of like wishing, longing for other people to see their inner being, but I'm familiar with that feeling. But how do you actually respond to a person who is feeling that in the moment? Of course, you wouldn't just say, just get in touch with your inner being. Maybe you would. Some people might. But I wonder what his skillful approach would be. Being a teacher for many years, how do you communicate with somebody in that situation? Communicate that feeling that he wants them to get in touch with that inner thing. Of course, it's different when people are asking for help and when they're not, but just curious.
Feel fear in your own experience and when you look at what's coming and where we are? Where does fear live or not in you?
I don't feel afraid, Mark. Just
No
to answer
fear.
your question simply.
No fear.
Obviously, I see that the world is in a state of upheaval, and who knows what's coming. But I don't feel afraid of it. Of course, whatever happens, I will have to face it moment by moment. I can't tell you how I will respond to it. I respond as I respond now, moment to moment, to my experience, whatever is involved. But I live in Oxford in England. It's a benign place to live compared to if you were living in Beirut a few weeks ago, so I'm not being confronted on the streets on a daily basis by the kind of upheaval and danger that I know many are facing.
So even in your role as a father, for example, you don't get triggered around fear or around these kinds of.
Mark really wants Rupert to be angry. He's really pushing for it. You sure you don't get angry at this? Let me just give you every single situation where it's possible for somebody to get angry. Are you sure? He's really looking for something here. Yeah, I mean, it's inconceivable, I guess, in some ways, right? To know all the things that make you angry, and it's hard to untangle, to get away from that natural response in yourself, and you assume that that is a natural response for everybody. And even when you're going to this goal of wanting to not have that be your natural response, it may be sort of dumbfounding to talk to somebody who doesn't have that response. And in fact, it may even be anger-inducing in yourself. You're mad that other people aren't mad. Some typical things that could happen. But this is interesting how much he's pushing. This is the third time asking for like a different situation. If he gets angry, if he gets
these kinds of sort of insecurity.
I feel concern for I have a 21-year-old son. I feel concern for my son. I feel concern for when I see him and his friends, and I think of all the people his age, roughly his age, or all the young that are coming into their adult life. I feel for all of them. Obviously, I witness it with my son because I'm having conversations with him about what's he going to do when he leaves university, and is there going to be a job for him? How's he going to manage? All this kind of what will the world look like in 5 and 10 years' time, politically, ecologically, etc. So, of course, I'm confronted with it most immediately in relation to him and my nephews and nieces. But I feel it for all that generation. I feel concerned for all of them.
Yes. So, in terms of your work as a teacher, I want to ask you, if you don't mind, what are the misconceptions around the direct path or around Advaita that you run up against that are?
Well, the main misconception, Mark, around non-duality in general and the direct path in particular is that it is intellectual and difficult and dry. That's the main misconception.
difficult, dry.
You talk about in some of your talks, New Age, non-duality, or New Age.
Yes. What I mean by New Age non-duality is there's nobody here. There's nothing to do. Just every single question, whatever the question. And the questions come from, over the last 10 years. Also, I've heard thousands of questions, and they just come from the entire spectrum of experience. And to answer every question in one way or another with "there's nobody here, there's nothing to do."
Nothing to do.
I find that
You're already there.
totally inadequate. It's true that there is no individual separate self. And therefore, the question of whether or not there is something for a separate self to do is really moot, because there isn't a separate self either to do something or not to do something. But I find it so unsatisfactory to simply respond to every question with "there's nobody here and there's nothing to do." And not only that, I feel that it betrays not only a lack of sensitivity, and intelligence, but a lack of
Oh.
honesty.
Oh,
It's just so easy.
oh, that was a burn right there. Okay. Lack of sensitivity. Okay. Lack of intelligence. Whoa. Lack of honesty. Oh boy. Rupert coming out with a hot attacks here. Okay. That's interesting. Um, that's very interesting. But it's so true. Like when you have these ideas, like the idea that there's no one here, there's nothing to do. I mean, it's I guess that's the ultimate, that's where we want to go, maybe. That's sort of the idea that people want to get to. They want to embody that and feel that. But clearly, if they're asking questions, they're working in a different framework. And it's a tough job to straddle multiple different frameworks. If you want to bring somebody to your framework, but you have to like jump to theirs to pull them over. Right? And this is sort of the exact same thing I was talking about with propping up science. So if somebody asks a question, they want proof for if meditation works, or something like that. They want proof if enlightenment is going to be helpful. And I give them proof, that's propping up their scientific framework. It's not bringing them over to this framework. It's propping up their framework. So in the same way, if somebody asks a question and you engage with their question by jumping over to their framework and trying to pull them back over to this sort of there's nothing to do, there's no one there framework, you kind of prop up their framework. So one way is just to stick hard and fast in the framework that there's no one here. No one here. Nothing being said, no one speaking. And it's actually very, very insensitive because it's a purely spiritual framework, I suppose. It's hard to really describe it. It's not quite emotional. It's not quite intellectual. It's not any of those other things. So it sort of rejects, in a sense, you can just completely reject intellectualism and completely reject your emotionality, completely reject all that stuff, and only talk about spiritual until somebody actually gets it. And there you go. It's done. So I have lots of sympathy, and I can totally understand why somebody might do that. Why somebody might just hold in their own framework of nothing to do, because the whole point is for somebody to get that framework and understand it, not to prop up scientific frameworks or some other emotional somethingness or whatever other things. So I'm not sure if it's necessarily a lack of intelligence or a lack of honesty, but okay, we had to had that little nuance there.
It's just so easy. I mean, just anybody can just set up their stall on YouTube or website.
Oh no!
And you know, put all the right words,
Oh no!
or and just respond to everybody. There's nobody here, and there's nothing to do.
Oh no! Oh no! Okay, there's another emotional attack. He's saying it's so easy, but that's not. That doesn't take away from the thing. Just because something's easy doesn't mean it's bad or not valued, right? And the same for a lot of people say, this is just saying the same thing over and over again, right? We need something new. No. New is not better. Old is not worse. These are the hierarchies that we want to kind of get beyond sometimes. Interesting, Rupert. Interesting.
So that's what I would consider New Age non-duality, and of course, like a lot of New Age teaching, there's truth in it.
Yeah, of course.
There is, as I said, there is ultimately no individual or separate self, but that does not mean that it's appropriate to answer every question and to dismiss anybody who might want to know what the nature of consciousness is, how they might be happy, how to cope with the loss of a loved one or the death of a child, or it's just a story. It's just a story you're telling yourself. I mean,
imagine like a sobbing family member, like a sobbing mother coming. Oh no, just mourning the death of family, and then you're like, it's just narratives, bro. It's just like sensations. That is so toxic. People can do that. People can be toxic like that. I wonder if even, and it is so tricky because like I'm explaining it in this way, and I think this could be helpful for some people, but it could also do that thing that I'm referring to is propping up intellectual stuff because I'm talking about it in an intellectual way, and I'm very clearly defining these things, and I think that could have the danger of actually propping up intellectualism more so than it should be. So. As I'm doing this, I have a strong sympathy for the approach of just saying, "There's no one here, nothing to do. You're already there. You're enlightened. Everything's perfect. Feel the love." But it is also very insensitive. It's purely spiritual. None of the emotionality, none of the intellectual.
I find this disingenuous.
Disingenuous. Interesting.
If there's nobody there and there's nothing to do, why are they teaching in the first place?
Oh no, Rupert, don't go that far. No, the person could be speaking very emptily. He could be emptily. I mean, we don't know the inner workings of a person, but if we get caught up looking at the expressions of somebody's actions, the expressions, and we think that that necessarily ties to their inner being, then we're wrong. We're missing something. If we think that every time somebody doesn't cry because they step on an ant, that they hate ants. That was a dumb example. It would think that every time somebody drinks water, they're craving water, right? If somebody is like currently surviving, that means that they must crave survival, or they're taking care of their body, which means that they crave their body, or you get the picture here. That's kind of messed up. Right, because then we could throw the same thing back at Rupert. He's saying if somebody thinks that there's no one here, nothing to do, he said he believes it anyway. Okay. I'm getting overexcited right now, but I know he knows this. I think he knows this. And he's not giving any nuance here, which is probably good to not give the nuance, but I'm here to add nuance. Okay, we're adding nuance. I don't think this is an appropriate, non-appropriate. I don't like this type of attack. It doesn't seem very holistic. It seems as if holism is better. It doesn't seem there's something that feels off to me to attacking that way. Because that same attack could be applied to Rupert, and obviously he wouldn't accept it. I don't know.
Why? Presumably they expect people to come to their talks and listen to them. So let's not go there anymore, but that's
but he's laughing at himself too, so he knows, of course he knows.
That's what I would consider to be new age non-duality.
Yeah.
But let's leave that aside, going back to your pitfalls. And of course I understand why people consider the Advaita teaching in general, and the direct path in particular, to be cold, heady sometimes. But if it's well explained, and it is explained not in intellectual terms, but it's explained as it's not really that it's explained, but if whoever is speaking about it has the ability to actually walk us through the process experientially.
Yes,
it's the difference between going going for a walk in the park together and describing going in a walk.
I love that he said that you can explain it, but then he like immediately ate the word, because sometimes we use language like explain or understand and stuff like that, and it means specifically a type of understanding, like a logical, linear sort of understanding. Explaining means that you're explaining it in a logical, coherent, linear type of way. It's a specific type of understanding, is a specific type of explanation, and he wants to get underneath the narrow usage of those words and sort of broaden it to apply to other categories. But we don't have language that does that. We don't have this sort of abstractable language. So generally when people say understand, they mean that in a particular way, but he means to say that he wants people who can express it, not in the intellectual way, not in the logical way, not even in the emotional way, but in the spiritual way. And how do you do it in the spiritual way? I don't know. But you're doing it in the spiritual way. That's so great. I love to see the language eat itself as it comes out.
I agree that to describe going for a walk in the path is intellectual, however beautifully described it is. But actually to go out together and walk through the path together. That to me is the real teaching, the experiential teaching. And
absolutely, man. It's like, I can talk all about music theory all I want, but we can't confuse my talking about music theory with listening to the music. And after we listen to the music, we understand music is the important part. We can listen to the music, and then we can reference music theory, and that helps a lot. It actually supports our listening. But we're never confused into thinking that the music theory is the music. Same here, we're not ever confused that the description of the walk into park is better or more important or more foundational than the actual walking in the park. And the description can help. It can help a lot. It can help us remember. It can help us see things a little bit more clearly. But we never confuse the description with the actual walking. However, when we talk about spiritual stuff, oftentimes we confuse our intellectualizing, we confuse our emotionality with the actual spiritual stuff. Tricky.
there's nothing intellectual about that. It's highly experiential and very simple. Simple, direct, easy. Almost anybody, any of the 7 billion of us, with simple, clear guidance, could follow it in their experience.
Well, it's not limited to humans either.
Talk to me about what a world founded on non-duality looks like.
Interesting.
You know, let's say, I mean, obviously this is speculation, but let's say 100 years from now, the direct path really has become the primary ethos, the primary way of looking at the world.
Why is he so excited? I love it.
Well, quite a lot changes, because the fundamental understanding that is really shared by all the religious and spiritual traditions that have a non-dual core or a non-dual understanding, that the fundamental understanding is that everyone and everything share their being.
Everyone and everything.
In other words, there aren't 7 billion beings or 7 trillion beings if we include all the animals, or 7 zillion beings if we include all the objects.
Yeah, there we go. Oh, go farther.
There's just being.
Oh, you didn't go farther. Don't forget the imaginary objects. Don't forget the combinations of imaginary and real. Don't forget all the groups of people and groups of bacteria and all the other things that can go in between. Don't forget the imaginary and things that are not imaginable. Don't forget all of that stuff. All of it too. It's all the same. It's all the same. It has the same essence. We're all connected. Don't forget it.
You can't even say there's one being. There's just
not
being.
Even one. Yeah. No quantity,
and
right?
Everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence from that being.
Yep.
That is really, if you were to put non-duality in a nutshell, that would be at least one way. Of course, there are other ways one could speak for it, but that would be one way of describing it. If one understood that and felt that, and led a life that was consistent with that feeling, understanding, you wouldn't need any more teaching. That would be sufficient.
I can't agree with this at all. But I love it. But I don't agree. I love it so much, but I don't agree. How do you embody this, right? So if we get woke on spirit, if we get woke on the spiritual stuff and say all beings are the same, okay, we have some sort of vague conception that survival is important, so we want to help beings survive, and we can sort of read the goals of ants moving around and okay, maybe it wants to go in that direction, maybe you can help it. Don't move ants though, because it has smelling trails and stuff, and that makes it confused, but whatever, who cares? We can have this, but then when you get to things that are I have these objects, I've got my tea set here. Did that cause suffering or not? Does it want to be like this, or does it want to be does it want to be used properly? Does it want to be not used? I didn't brush my set today. Does it want to be brushed? Does it hurt that I didn't brush it? How do we can't, we don't, I can't fulfill the satisfaction of everything. And of course, you have split beings, right? I am one person. I may have multiple intentions. So if you do something good for me in terms of, I don't know, health, that might be a good thing. But then there are other parts of me which maybe completely overlap exactly the same in the physical, actual reality, scientific sense that has completely the opposite intentions. So you're causing the suffering and the pleasure at the exact same time, right? Because any system is not only limited to the physical being. It can be all the physical things plus some imaginary, and a physical plus another imaginary. And you can have two systems which overlap exactly in the sort of normal, external, scientific consensus reality world, but has completely different intentions. And anything that you do may lead to its suffering and its not suffering at the same time. How do you work with that? How do you work with that? If you fully embody this, how do you work with that? I don't know. That's tough. That's a tough one. I don't think that feeling that everything is one is an effective way for treating anything better. In fact, there are lots of people who feel like, hey, everything's connected, but they treat themselves like crap. How do you think they're going to treat you? I can barely treat myself like, well, it's hard to like treat yourself like yourself. Sometimes if we pay a lot of attention, do we usually treat ourselves like ourselves? No, we treat ourselves like junk. It's so hard. So I don't know. I can't agree with this, though. Of course, I want to caveat again. Rupert knows way more. He is way more advanced. He's done this a lot longer than I have. So take his answer much more seriously than my own answer. But I cannot agree. Cannot agree.
Because we would not only understand,
the world would be no
but
different.
we would feel that everyone and everything is our very own self. Now look at the...
Again, I barely treat myself like myself. I barely treat myself like myself. I try my hardest to treat myself like myself. I do. I'm getting much better at it. But most of the times I don't. How do I treat the world? If I can't treat myself like myself, how do I treat the world? I don't know.
Political upheaval that we're experiencing now. Look at the ecological crisis. Let's just take these two. Both these crises are founded upon, in the first case, the idea that other people are others. And in terms of the ecological crisis, that the world is other, separate from us. And that gives us, in the first case, it gives us permission, the belief that others are other than ourselves. It gives us the permission to treat people in unjust, unkind, unloving ways. And in terms of nature, the belief that we are separate from the world allows us to treat nature in a way that exploits and degrades it. So if we were to truly understand, as a culture, as a world culture, if we were to truly understand, and not to mention, in between these two examples, I could have spoken about the way animals are treated. If we were to understand, not just understand, but feel that everyone is our very own being, that what I essentially am is the very same self, not similar, but the same self that you are. How is that going to impact the way I relate to you and treat you? And if I were to say feel the same about animals,
I love the optimism. He's got such a great energy. I love his smile. He's got this good optimism. I just cannot agree.
Would I treat animals? And not only that, but if I were to feel the same about nature, about the world, about the objects, about the plants, about how would I treat the planet? How, if I were to live in a way that was consistent with this feeling, understanding, and if everyone were to do so, that would transform our society.
It would transform our society.
Beautiful. We can only pray.
I love it.
We can only pray, and
or we can do it ourselves.
As you and I and innumerable others are doing, each of us in our own way. We can only help to share our understanding, such as it is, in our own way, and each of us has our own way that is particular to our conditioning and our characters.
Do you still make pottery?
No, I don't. I don't, Mark. I miss it sometimes, but no, I don't. Life, quite unexpectedly, 10 or so years ago, took another turn. I wrote the first book, The Transparency of Things, and then imagined that I would just go back to my studio and spend the rest of my life there, which is what I had always thought I was destined for. And then invitations began, and I began speaking and traveling, and then the whole thing kind of grew and took off. And so no, now
cool.
I don't.
You do miss it sometimes?
I do miss it. Sometimes I get it's like a very deep impulse in me to make something with my hands. I do miss it sometimes. Yes. Yes.
Let me see if there's anything else I
Oh my goodness.
wanted to ask.
I love
you
this so much.
particularly.
Rupert is such a good guy. He's got
The
this
last thing
energy.
I'd like to ask you, Rupert, if I might, is what does hope mean to you? Hope is such a loaded term and
He's got energy too. I like him.
complicated. What is it? How do you respond to it?
I'm with T.S. Eliot. Hope is always hope for the wrong thing.
Can you say more?
Oh.
Expectation would always be expectation for the wrong thing. What we are hoping for, what we are hoping is going to happen, is already happening.
Yeah.
Or rather, it is already present. You see,
We're already perfect, man.
if we're hoping for something, that thing is by definition not present now.
Yep.
So we must be hoping for some kind of objective experience in the future. So if we are hoping for something, and obviously you mean hope in terms of our deepest desire for happiness.
I love that he also said that we're hoping for an objective experience in the future. Oh, why do we have this bias for something that's objectively happening in the external scientific reality, right? We call it objective reality. Why is that more important than some sort of hypothetical reality or fake reality or some sort of imagined reality or non-imagined, not objective? Why? Why do we have these hierarchies? I love that he pointed that out.
Happiness. If we're hoping for something in the future that will finally bring us peace or fulfillment, this hope betrays the fact that our desire for peace and fulfillment is still invested in objective experience.
Objective reality. Don't be a slave to objective reality.
Is invested in objective experience, we are destined for disappointment.
How, when, why, if, because all the killers of happiness. Don't get caught up in that. Yes.
The reason we're all interested in these matters in the first place is because we have either understood or we have at least intuited that peace and happiness cannot be found in objective experience. So to continue to hope for some marvelous enlightened experience that is finally going to make us happy, it's a recipe for disappointment.
Yes.
What we long for is present now. What all people long for, above all else,
strong
peace or fulfillment. Enlightenment is just the exotic word for fulfillment. What everyone longs for, above all else, peace, fulfillment, it lies in our being.
Strong language here. What everyone longs for. I completely disagree. Maybe he longs for that because he's at this permanent perspective shift where he longs for this deep satisfaction or fulfillment or whatever. Oh, but I've had those times, and I'm sure you have too. Most of us aren't enlightened. So we have understood that there are many, many times when we prefer the suffering. There's a reason why we're doing it. We're suffering because we like it. And we can subtly change our worldview back into this worldview where Rupert has, that we want this fulfillment, deep fulfillment and peace and tranquility of the moment. And we can go into it. We can fall into it very quickly and easily. But we might go back into our old habit patterns of preferring the suffering, preferring the seeking, preferring the wanting to know. Oh, and it comes and goes, and it comes and goes. And we must be gentle with ourselves. We don't have to be. We must be gentle with ourselves. We don't have to, okay? You can be mean to yourself. You can be mean to yourself, but you're not going to get anywhere. Maybe. Who knows? I don't know. But what he's projecting onto us is not necessarily the case. I wish it were, though. It would be so cool if I always wanted this deep fulfillment and this deep tranquility because it's so easy to access. It's so easy. It's always right here. It's available. If only we wanted it. If only we paid more attention. One day, though. One day in the future, after some mystical experience. One day, right? One day. All you have to do is shift to get back into that present moment awareness. loose way of putting it, and feel the deep love and connectivity of the entire universe. Another loose way of putting it. And we stop seeking, and we're here. And we embody the qualities that he thinks that we embody. He thinks that we have naturally underneath. Oh, we don't. But we can.
But in order to access it, we need to recognize our being, how it essentially is.
Yes.
And for most of us now, our being or our self is so thoroughly mixed up with the content of experience. But although all of us have the sense of being myself, all of us have the knowledge I am, we don't know ourselves clearly. And it is for this reason that our innate peace and joy is not fully felt. And it is for this reason that we project it onto an object in the future. And we hope that one day this object or this person, this relationship, this teacher, this something will happen. It won't.
It won't.
And what about hoping for change in the world, for example? Hoping for
hoping for change in the world. That would be a different sort of hope. Yes, that would be like a prayer. That this understanding that we are speaking of, namely the understanding that everyone and everything shares their being, it would be a prayer that this comes to pass in our culture. That's a beautiful. That's you could say it was a hope, or it's even more than a hope. It's a prayer that a significant number of people recognize this. And as a result, this understanding begins to infiltrate the mainstream.
Infiltrate.
You're quite right, Mark. In that sense,
covert opposite.
Hope would be perfectly legitimate. And like you, I hope or pray for such a situation.
As do I.
I feel that hope.
It's been really wonderful speaking to you, Rupert. Thank you so much.
Not at all. As I say, Mark, I first came across you with the book you did about art with Andrew Harvey 25 years ago. So I was very, very, very delighted to be invited by you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak
so
with you.
much. And please take good care of yourself.
Oh, he
likewise
will.
Yourself. And who knows? I think you talk at the SANG conference. Maybe when if and when we all start. Well, no, when we all start traveling, at least to an extent. Again, I hope maybe our paths will cross in the flesh one day.
Aww.
I hope so too.
Cute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Take care.
Be well. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
These two people, they're so cute. They're so cute. They're so nice. I love their energy. They're both really smiley. Mark and Rupert. Wow, what two lovely, lovely individuals. Okay, we got to say some nice things in the comments. If it's not clear, I completely, fully, absolutely 100% agree with everything that Rupert was saying, and Mark. I completely agree. I know it may have sounded like I was disagreeing, even emphatically, but I'm agreeing hardcore, adding a little bit of my own nuance, a different way, different perspective of seeing the same things. I'm trying to get my own flavor into it, I guess. I'm throwing in my own ego into it. Yeah, maybe. What do we say? I love both of your energy. Smiley face, right? We got to get smiley faces here. I'm gonna get. We're getting some authentic. We're doing a double. We're gonna do a triple smiley face because these guys are making me happy. All right. There, smile, and we got to get the in love. The in love. There we go. I'm in love. Such great people. Oh my goodness. That's gonna be great energy to continue the rest of my day. I so appreciate it. Okay guys, wow, we did it. Wow, we did it. We had so much fun. I appreciate everybody who's here, hanging out, everybody lurking, everybody chatting, everybody following, everybody subscribing. What? Are you liking the video? Are you commenting down below? I appreciate all the people here. You guys are awesome. And I'm not limited to people who are here, let's say in physical reality and objective reality, We're beyond that, all right? We're beyond that, okay? We're getting to all the imaginary people. There are millions of imaginary people out there watching this video, and I appreciate every single one of you guys, okay? And there may be even future people out there watching this video, okay? Okay, maybe not too deep. But I so appreciate every single one of you guys being here. Thanks so much for having to take the time out of your day to get maybe inspired to practice and to see the infinite love and you know the things. Okay, you guys are cool. Remember, it's hard to take care of yourself. Is that what I said? No. You see yourself as yourself? No, that's not it. That's not it. We want to see everybody as you, right? And you want to treat everyone as if they were you, right? But the first thing you must do is treat yourself like yourself. So please do that. Be healthy, be happy, maybe eat some healthy foods, maybe take a walk, maybe get a little bit of sun. Definitely go to sleep early, all these things. You know what to do. We've known it for years. Please do it. Okay, I'll be back on Friday. Thanks for hanging out. Bye-bye.